Yeah. All right, so let's start. Last week we started with a new era, right? We finished with the era of the Tannaim. The Tannaim are the Hachamim mentioned basically from the men of the Great Assembly, right? The last of them is Shimon HaTzadik, right? All the way down to Rabbeinu HaKadosh, also known as Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, also known as Rebbe, just like the Rebbe, without any name afterwards. The composer of the Mishnah, right? That was the era of the Tannaim, and during the era of the Tannaim, our focus was on the land of Israel, right? We had the temple, the second temple there for most of that time, and the era following the destruction of the temple, of persecution, until relative peace in the times of Rebbe, the composer of the Mishnah. And so most of the Tanaic literature, since it was all in the land of Israel, or mostly focused around the land of Israel, was in Hebrew. And now we're moving on to the post-Tanaic, or the post-Mishnah era. In our focus now is in Babylon. That's where the center of Torah moved, the transition from Eretz Israel to Babylon, right? Iraq, modern day Iraq area, Iraq and Persia. And over there, a lot of the literature, some of it is still in Hebrew, but a lot of it now is in Aramaic, because that is the spoken language of the area and of the Jews in the area. All right, and now it started off with the students of Rabbi Judah HaNasi, the composer of the Mishnah. We saw he has some of his students, was Rabbi Hiya, who we'll speak a little bit more of today, and Rav and Shemuel, some of, like two of his main students who moved to Bavel, and they each had their own yeshiva in Bavel. All right, so that was basically the transition from Eretz Israel to Bavel. And they all had their own writings. And then we went on to speak about the Yerchei Kala, which actually started earlier, but it really turned it into a big event during this post-Tanaic era, during the times where the yeshivot of Bavel were the main focus. And does anyone remember what the Yerchei Kala is? Would somebody like to remind us and the rest of the class what the Yerchei Kala is?
The time when they read two Maseket in a year during Elul, and I forgot the other one.
Right, in Elul and Adar. Right, so twice a year, they'd all gather in the yeshivot. People would drop what they're doing, right? All the students from all over the area, not just in the areas of the yeshivot, but all over Bavel. And some would come maybe from Eretz Israel, and later on they'd come from other places. Wherever the Jews are spread out, back then they weren't tremendously spread out all over the world like they are today or in the past 1,000 years. They'd all gather in the yeshivot for an entire month, twice a year, and during that month they would discuss one masechet, right, during 1 month, and this would happen twice a year, so 2 masechtot a year. Prepare for 5 months, gather in the yeshivot and discuss that masechet for 1 month, and then they'd be notified by the Rosh Yeshiva what is the masechet of the next Kala month, right? And then they prepare that masechet for 5 months, and then they'd gather in the yeshivot for that 6th month and discuss that next Masechet for an entire month. And this was a huge event to the point where it wasn't just a matter if you are one of the students of the Hachamim, you would go, everybody would go. Everybody would go because you have thousands and tens of thousands of people gathering. So if you're a merchant, right, if you have anything, any product to sell, that's the place to be. And so everybody would gather in the yeshivot. And this is what turned the yeshivot of Bavel into basically the capital of the Jewish nation after the destruction of Jerusalem. And they had relative peace in Bavel at that time. It was peaceful enough that people can gather in the yeshivot, tens of thousands of people twice a year, for every year, and this went on for about 900 years. Just during this time of the Amoraim, right up until the Talmud Bavli was written and sealed, that's when the Yerchei Kala really had its main, we'll call it its main popularity. And this is actually the foundation of how the Talmud was written to begin with, because it's basically a recording of all these discussions that took place during these 2 months every single year. Okay, so now let's move on to the literature that was put together after the times of the Mishnah of Rabbi Judah HaNasi. All right, so we have the Tosefta, we have the Jerusalem Talmud, and the Sifra and Sifri. So Rav, if you remember, he was one of the main students of Rabbi Judah HaNasi, the composer of the Mishnah, right? And he moved to Bavel and became a head in Bavel, one of the heads of the yeshivot. Hiber Sifra v'Sifri, right? He composed 2 books. One is called the Sifra, one is called the Sifri. And we saw that there were other Sifra and Sifri that were written earlier, part of the Tannaim literature, right? Now we're in Amoraim literature, right? So basically the books of halachot on the book of Exodus and Leviticus, right? These are called Sifra and Sifri. So Rav also wrote the Sifra and Sifri. What was the purpose? Leva'er ulhodia ikare HaMishnah, right? The purpose was to further expand the Mishnah. Other than Rav, there's also the Bihiyah, Hiber HaTosefta. So another student, we saw he was one of the younger students of Rebbe Hiyah. He wrote another publication called the Tosefta. Tosefta literally means it's like the expansion pack to the Mishnah. And this Tosefta today is published with every edition of the Talmud. At the end of every tractate of the Talmud, you can flip to the end of the book and you have the Tosefta that Rebbe Hiyah wrote. And the purpose of that was also Levaer Inyanei HaMishnah. It's all focused on the Mishnah, to further expand the Mishnah itself. V'chen Rebbe Hoshaya, we saw he's also written something in the Aleph over here. Hoshaya or Hoshaya, one of the students of Rabbi Judah HaNasi. Ubar Kapapa. Sorry?
With sorry, I'm confused because Tosfos, it sounds similar to Rashi's grandsons.
Right,
yes?
right,
It's a similar word?
It's a similar word. Tosafot in general means addition or expansion. So, but don't confuse that with the Tosefta, which was written by the student of Rabbi Judah HaNasi, right? And the Tosefta is an expansion to the Mishnah itself, as opposed to the Tosafot, which is also printed on every page of the Mishnah, of every page of the Talmud. You have on one side, you have Rashi. We're talking about Rashi lived about 900 years ago. And his grandsons, who it's not just one generation of Tosafot. It really, those Tosafot evolved over a few generations, right? They're also printed opposite Rashi on the page of the Talmud, right? But those are more raising questions. They're more like what they call like lamdanut, limudi. They definitely don't have the same authority as the Tosefta, and we'll see how much authority the Tosefta has soon, right? The Tosfot is good for raising questions and trying to figure out an answer. Sometimes they propose answers. They don't always propose answers. That's the Tosafot of the descendants of Rashi. All right. Does that answer your question?
Kind of. It's just really confusing because so many words are so similar to me.
Right. Because they have the same root word because they have the same meaning. It's meant to be in addition to, right? So the Tosafot is in addition to the Talmud, written by the descendants of Rashi, while the Tosefta is in addition to the Mishnah itself, which was written by the student of Rabbi Judah Hanasi, right? Rabbi Hiya and also Rav Oshaya. But they're two different things. The Tosafot is post-Amoraim also. It's even post-Yoni, which we didn't even get to that period yet. Okay? So, וכן רבי הושעיה ובר כפרה חיברו ברייתות לבאר דברי המשנה. All right? So there's all this literature coming up now that they all have one focus. They all have one intention. It's to explain the Mishnah. They're all coming to explain the Mishnah. ורבי יוחנן חיבר התלמוד הירושלמי בארץ ישראל. Right, so we're talking about the main focus now is in Bavel. One of the students of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi is Rabbi Yohanan, and he stayed in Eretz Israel. And during this period, he wrote the Talmud Yerushalmi, which itself is also focused on the Mishnah. So all the literature that comes post-Mishnah all comes to explain and to further elaborate the Mishnah itself, that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi wrote. Right? So we're talking about Rav Sherira Gaon, who wrote a very long letter to the community in Tunis about how the Mishnah and the Talmud were composed. So they asked him, who wrote the Tosefta? So in his answer, he says, surely it was written by Rabbi Hiya, right? There's no doubt about that. Everybody agrees that Rabbi Hiya wrote the Tosefta. However, it says, Velo yadanu beverur im bimei Rabbi Sidera wa harav. However, we don't know if the Tosefta itself was written while Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was still alive or only after he passed away. אבל אין ספק יחר שנסדרו הלכות המשנה סודרה התוספתא. Right? However, we have no doubt that the Tosefta was written after the Mishnah itself was written, right? Because it's built on the structure of the Mishnah. וברור כי דבריה מאוחרים הם מן המשנה, and we know that it's later, it's post-Mishnah. אמנם זה אמרו חכמים כי בימי רבי סודרה התוספתא ולימדוה מן הזמן ההוא במדרשו של רבי. All right, so we know it was written post Mishnah. It's definitely by Rabbi Hiya, the student of Rabbi Judah Hanasi, and it was taught in that same school of Rabbi Judah Hanasi in his court. Right? Once after the Mishnah was completed and everyone was studying the Mishnah, so Rabbi Hiya wrote the Tosefta to further elaborate the Mishnah, and that was also part of the official curriculum of the yeshiva, to study the Mishnah and to study the Tosefta. And we see the Tosefta was adopted by almost all the Hachamim, as opposed to all the other writings like Sifra and Sifre that we saw before, right? So different Hachamim learned different books. Everyone accepted the Mishnah and everyone studied the Mishnah, and all the stuff that was written on the Mishnah, or out of all the stuff that was written on the Mishnah, the Tosefta got precedence. Everybody also accepted the Tosefta as a secondary to the Mishnah itself. Right? אילו ביקש רבי לכתוב ולחבר כל מה ששנה בימיו, היו הדברים ארוכים וגאים, והיו מתעכרים. Right? So why was there a need to write further elaboration on the Mishnah? He says, well, if Rabbi Judah Nasi wanted to write everything that was mentioned in his days, the Mishnah wouldn't have been 6 volumes. It could have been 100 volumes, right? There's no end to how much you can expand the Mishnah, right? But if the purpose of the Mishnah is so that everybody has a common text that they can study, remember, Mishnah also means to study it off by heart, and this is meant to come, and this is the first time there's a written text for an oral tradition. So even then, it's intended to be studied orally so that people can recite it off by heart. And then if he'd elaborate on everything, there'd be no end to the Mishnah, and that completely defeats the purpose. Right? It would have been completely uprooted. There'd been no purpose to the Mishnah, which Rebbe is trying to put together. אכן רבי תיקן וכתב עיקר הדברים דרך כלל בלשון קצר. Right? So Rabbi Judah HaNasi, he put together the Mishnah, he put it, made it very general, right? And very precise and concise and brief and short. כי אפילו אחד הדברים יש ללמוד ממנו כמה טעמים ותילי תילים של הלכות. Right, even one phrase of the Mishnah alludes to and hints to a vast variety of halachot that you can study from it. For instance, right, the first Mishnah that we have in Masechet Berachot, right, the tractate of Berachot, of saying blessings, right? How does it start? It says, right? When do we start saying the Shema prayers in the evenings? It says, right? From the hour or from the time that the Kohanim, right, start to eat their terumah. Later on in the Talmud, starts to ask, wait, so what is this time that they start to eat their terumah? I said, oh, it's from sunset. Okay, so it's from sunset, or from when you could see 3 stars. So why didn't the Mishnah just say from sunset? Why does it say from the time that the Kohanim start to eat their terumah? I have to say, figure out now, oh, so wait, the Kohanim, what does it mean that they eat their terumah? Well, if they are pure, well, they can eat their terumah anytime. No, so it's talking about Kohanim who are impure that first have to go to the mikveh, right, and dip themselves in water, and only after the sun sets are they pure and eligible to eat the terumah. They say, well, why are you going all around? He says, well, that's the point. The Mishnah is trying to teach you as many laws as possible in as few words as possible. So from here you could learn, right? It's like a way to remember, because back then everyone knew the halachot. So they know there's a connection between when the Kohanim are now pure from being tameh and they're able to eat the terumah, and that's also the same time that you can start doing Kiryat Shema. And this way, Rabbi Judah Nasi is linking many halachot together. But then what happens is over time, people don't know all the laws of Tum'ah and Tahara, right? Because there is no such thing, there's almost no such thing as Tum'ah and Tahara anymore. Nobody goes to the mikveh now before eating something, because there is no terumah anymore. So now there's a need for the students of Rabbi Judah HaNasi to come and further elaborate the words of the Mishnah. Things that were very obvious to the Hachamim in the times of Rabbi Judah HaNasi, and they saw this masterpiece called the Mishnah and say, wow, in one sentence he was able to connect 3 or 4 laws, right? Now it's not so obvious anymore. And the student of Rabbi Judah HaNasi, they see this and they say, okay, I'm going to write a Tosefta in addition to the Mishnah to further elaborate the words of the Mishnah, right? Because one Mishnah, afilu ehad devarim, this is just the first sentence of the Mishnah, yesh lilmod mimenu kama te'amim. You could learn a few rules or a few logical rules to guide you in making Pesach halacha, v'tilei tinim shel halachot, and many halachot out of just a few words of the Mishnah. V'hagadot gedolot v'niflaot, right? And many sayings, also agadot, as in also midrashim, you can learn from these, from the words of the Mishnah. However, it's all hinted in the Mishnah, and you need to have a great knowledge of the halacha in order to extract that from the Mishnah. All right, because the Mishnah was put together, says even it's like by the guidance of God, like He directed, right? The Rabbi Meir, who we said most of the Mishnayot are from the hands of from the words of Rabbi Meir. He really guided the Hachamim in putting it together. Right, so Devarav Shel Rebbe, right? So the words of Rabbi Judah HaNasi in the Mishnah, Devarim Ketzarim Akulilim Inyanim Rabbim, right? They include a lot of different things in every sentence of the Mishnah, can be expounded and extracted into many other halachot. V'haita berura etzlo merov hadut sichlo v'rohav binato, and this was very clear to Rabbi Judah HaNasi, right? All these things that he's hinting to in one sentence of the Mishnah to Rabbi Judah HaNasi, it was obvious. And also to the other Hachamim of his time. They understood what he was writing. Aval mi shelamata mimeno hinehi kasha alav, right? But someone who is lower in level than Rabbi Judah HaNasi, right, doesn't have the wisdom of the Hachamim, of the Tannaim, right? It's a lot more difficult for them to understand the Mishnah. Because all of the early Chachamim, all their writings, all their literature was primarily for themselves, notes to themselves. Therefore, לפיכך ראה אחד מתלמידיו והוא רבי חייא לחבר ספר ללכת בעקבות רבו. And so, the student of Rabbi Judah HaNasi, one of his main students, Rabbi Xiya, he saw a need to write an expansion to the Mishnah to further elaborate, לבאר בו מה שאינו ברור בדברי הרב, right? To further explain things that aren't so clear to us in what's written in the Mishnah. His master, his Rav, Rabbi Judah HaNasi, v'hiya Tosefta, and this is the Tosefta. ונתכוון בה לבאר המשנה ולהוסיף עניינים שאומנם אפשר ללמדם מן המשנה אבל אחרי יגיעה. Right, so his purpose was to kind of like show you the way how to extract halachot from the Mishnah, right? It's things that you could learn from the Mishnah. For instance, that Kriyat Shema and the time that the Kohanim eat terumah when they're pure is the same time, but you have to kind of like work. You have to put a lot of effort and maybe some kind of like intellectual acrobatics to get to that yourself if you don't already know it. So Rabbi Haya said, I'm going to make it a little bit easier for you. Right? Again, Rabbi Haya, he's a student of Rabbi Judah Hanasi. He's also in a very high level. So even the Tosefta itself, to us, needs more explaining. But to the other Chachamim that came after him, it was like another step, another improvement to understanding the Mishnah. Right? So he wrote this in order for us, or the later Hachamim, to learn how to extract halachot from the Mishnah. V'chen asa gam Rav Oshaya, and so too did his other student, Rav Oshaya. So there's Rav Oshaya and Rabbi Haya. They both wrote Toseftot. V'gam Rav, also Rav, we saw before, Chiber Baraita, v'hi Sifra v'Sifri. So here already you see, this is the Maimonides. He's already saying that the Sifra and the Sifri are Baraitot. Anybody remember what the word Baraita means? It's an Aramaic word. So Baraita literally means external. External to what? It's external to the Mishnah. Right? So the Tosefta we didn't refer to as a Baraita, although the Tosefta of Rav Oshaya we did. Earlier we said that Rav Oshaya wrote, right? Rav Oshaya and Bar Kapara wrote Baraitot, meaning all these other books, all this other literature, other than the Tosefta itself, they're referred to as external. Even the Tosefta is external, however, it has a higher status than all the other Amoraic literature that comes to expound the Mishnah. Okay? So this Sifra and Sifri, here we are, that was written by Rav and also by his counterpart Shemuel, right? These are already automatically considered Baraitot, external to the Mishnah, but they all have the same purpose. Virabim Zulatam, and there are many other Baraitot, lots of other literature, post-Mishnah literature, that's main focus is to explain the Mishnah and to teach halachot and to serve kind of like commentaries, right? Verabim Zulatam, and there's many others. Kmo sheomrim ki ata Rav Peloni ata, right? So Rav Peloni means like an anonymous rabbi, like John Doe. He went right from one place to another. Ve'iti matnita beyade, right? And he brought with him a Mishnah or the Mishnah. אבל אין בכל הברייתות הללו כמתק לשון המשנה ולא כסדר עניינה וקיצור לשונה. But none of these other books that were written are as beautifully written and as well structured as the Mishnah itself. ולפיכך נעשית היא העיקר, כלומר המשנה. And that's why the Mishnah is considered to be the primary text that everybody refers to. וכל אותם החיבורים תפלים לה. And all of the other literature that came out other than the Mishnah are secondary to the Mishnah. והיא החשובה בעיני הכלל. Right? And the Mishnah is what's most important to everybody. So the first thing that you're going to study is the Mishnah. Once you mastered the Mishnah, then you'll move on to the Tosefta. Once you master the Tosefta, you'll move on to Sifra, or Sifri, or Mechilta, or any of the other books that were written. But there's no point in learning the Sifra or the Sifri if you don't know the Mishnah yet. Not just you don't know the Mishnah. If you haven't memorized the Mishnah and know it inside out, don't skip stages and learn something that comes to explain the Mishnah, because the source of everything is the Mishnah. ובהשוואה לאותם החיבורים ראו הבנות וישירוה מלאכות ופילגשים ויהללוה. Right? And in comparison to all of the other literature that came even before the Mishnah, but definitely post-Mishnah, right? He quotes a pasuk from the Song of Songs, a verse from the Song of Songs, right? All the women saw it and praised it, right? And the queens, and they all praised and elevated the Mishnah. Rav Hiya, right now we're going back to Rav Sherira Gaon. Rabbi Hiya, Ube'er Baraita, he was already talking, he's referring to the Tosefta of Rabbi Hiya. Here he's also calling it a Baraita, external to the Mishnah. Peratim upanim le'ela ha'ikarim va'kelalim. And he comes to further elaborate the Mishnah. Rov ha'ta'amim ha'mvuarim b'baraita shorshehem b'Mishnah. And the vast majority of everything that's written in the Tosefta of Rabbi Hiya are rooted in the Mishnah itself. However, for someone untrained at the level of Rabbi Hiya and his generation, it's very difficult to find that root in the Mishnah alluding to what Rabbi Hiya comes to explain. Ki Rabbi Hiya talmid Rabbi Hiya, right? Because he was a student of Rabbi Judah Hanasi. V'asher limedo Rabbi hu hadavar asher shana Rabbi Hiya, right? And whatever it was that Rabbi Judah Hanasi taught Rabbi Hiya, that is what Rabbi Hiya wrote in the Tosefta. Ve'en me'umma Rabbi Hiya ela ma shaya leRabbi, right? And Rabbi Hiya doesn't have anything novel, anything new that he wasn't taught by his master, his teacher, Rabbi Judah Hanasi, right? Or Rebbe. ואפילו דיוקה דדברי המשנה הכריע בפירוש בברייתא. Diukim is when, little subtleties in the phrasing of the Mishnah that you can learn from those, like for instance, why was something said in plural form when you would think it should have been said in singular form? So, because the Rebbe Judah Hanasi, he's trying to teach you something. He's trying to allude to something else that maybe that's why he wrote it in plural form. Okay, so these little subtleties, right, are brought in the Tosefta to further explain the words of the Mishnah. V'sifra v'sifri dirushe ha'mikrahim lehorot ech nirmizu halachot b'mikra. Right, in these other books, the Sifra and Sifri, that were written by Rav and Shmuel, and we saw that there's also Sifra and Sifri that were written by the students of Rabbi Akiva, right? This is a pre-Mishnah, right? These books called Sifra and Sifri, they always come to teach you how to connect the halachot to the text of Scripture itself. What was the midah that they used? One of the 13 midot that they used to extract the halakha from Scripture itself. ומלפנים בבית שני בימי החכמים הראשונים כן היו לומדים אותם לפי דרך הזה. Right? We saw that earlier in the times of the Second Temple, we saw like the times of Rabbi Akiva and his students who also wrote a Sifra and Sifri. This was the way that they studied halakha. They would connect it to the verses themselves in Scripture. And so the students of Rabbi Judah Hanasi, post-Mishnah Era, right, are also writing similar literature, similar books, connecting the halachot that are taught in the Mishnah back to Scripture, right? How it could be learned from the verses of the written Torah. וכאשר ראו החכמים דבברייתות אחרות שלא מרבי חייא ורבי הושעיה, יש בהם שיבושים, ויש בהם פרטי הלכות הדומים לכללי יחידים ודברים בלתי מדויקים. However, when the Hachamim saw that the other books that were written that weren't authored by Rabbi Hiya or Rabbi Oshaya, right? Those two are called the Tosefta. That some of these other things, they weren't always as accurate as the words of Rabbi Hiya, or sometimes they brought opinions of not of the majority, but they brought a minority opinion, and so they saw they weren't as accurate as the Tosefta of Rabbi Hiya and Rabbi Oshaya. Right, because the Tosefta, which was authored by Rabbi Oshaya and Rabbi Hiya, were on a higher level. They were better and more accurate than all the others. Right, so all the Chachamim, they gathered, or they, that was like the next part of their library of every yeshiva and every Beit Midrash. You had to have the Mishnah, and you had to have the Tosefta. And there's other optional books, Sifra and Sifri, right? That you may want to delve deeper into, or you may not, and you may be satisfied with the Mishnah and the Tosefta. But what became part of the public curriculum, which everybody had to study, was first the Mishnah, and then the Tosefta, which was authored by Rabbi Hiya and Rabbi Oshaya. And that's why they have a higher status. When we say higher status, it's a higher legal status as well. So whenever in the Talmud they come to quote a Baraita, they'll say the Chachamim quoted. They'll say Tanya or Tanna. All right, and then they'll bring a quote, and we know that whenever they say that, they're bringing a quote from one of these external sources. However, whenever they're going to quote the Tosefta, they'll always say Tanu Rabbanan. Tanu Rabbanan is in plural. It means that all the Hachamim recite this. Why do all the Hachamim recite this? Because this is a mandatory in the yeshiva. And it's a quote from the Tosefta. So it's not as authoritative as the Mishnah. However, it's the most authoritative of everything post-Mishnah. Ve'alehem amru b'gemara tanu rabbanan. Right? And only referring to the Tosefta of Rabbi Hiya and or Rabbi Oshaya, they'll say Tanu Rabbanan. Tanu Rabbanan is all the Chachamim recite this. And they'll bring a paragraph, a phrase, or a quote from the Tosefta. ואף על פי כן היו מצויות גם ברייתות אחרות אשר הגו בהם החכמים. Right? And even though everybody recited the Tosefta, right, there were also other baraitot that they would study. However, it wasn't mandatory and it wasn't held in the same status as the Tosefta. Kol echad ve'echad kefi shelimedo rabbo. Right? So everyone would study what his rabbi teaches. Everybody teaches the Mishnah. Everybody teaches the Tosefta. Some rabbis, they prefer the Sifra. Others prefer, writing of a different Chacham. Right? But everybody quotes and studies and refers to the Tosefta. וגם התנאים לימדו אותם ביניהם, כגון עתי תנא דרבי חייא, right? Abar Ushayan, Tana Debe Rabbi Ami, right? So they quote Rabbi Hiya, they quote also Rabbi Ami, but the writings of Rabbi Ami weren't held in the same esteem as the writings of Rabbi Hiya. Ubar Kapara Gamken, Tana Mishnayot Acharot. And also another student of Rabbi Judah Hanasi, right? Same generation as Rabbi Hiya, there was also Bar Kapara, and he also wrote things, and the Chachamim also studied his writings. However, they weren't as authoritative as those of Rabbi Hiya. וחכמי בבל אשר היו לפני רבנו הקדוש הייתה המשנה עמהם, right? And also the Chachamim that were in Bavel, right? Because we said the times of the Tannaim, we were focused on Eretz Israel primarily. But there was also, in parallel, there were the yeshivot in Bavel, and they also studied the Mishnah. What does it mean, the Mishnah? It wasn't the Mishnah of Rabbi Judah Nasi. He's talking about other halachot that were written and composed in Bavel. All right? Because it's even talking about before Rabbeinu HaKadosh, before the Mishnah was written. The Mishnah literally means what you recite. Ki hayta benehem Torah harbe, right? They had a lot of hachamim there. It was still a very powerful center. You know, even like today, where we have all the great yeshivot in Eretz Israel, you still have big yeshivot in New York, right? So New York was like, Bavel was like the New York in the times of the Tannaim. Eventually, that became the center, the primary center, because the Torah in Eretz Israel was dying out. Hillel HaZaken Anam in Bavel, right? Hillel HaZaken, he went from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael. והיה נשיא בארץ ישראל בימי רבי, ואחריו היו קוראים בארץ ישראל לאלה המשניות דבני בבל בשם משנת רבי נתן. Right, so when Hillel HaZaken came to Eretz Israel, because he was in Bavel, remember Hillel HaZaken, we're talking about like 6-7 generations before Rabbeinu HaKadosh, the composer of the Mishnah. So during this time, talking about Hillel HaZaken, remember, and who was his son and predecessor, there was Rabban Gamliel and Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. Remember, all the way until we get down to Rabbeinu HaKadosh. Right, Hillel HaZaken is a great grandfather of Rabbeinu HaKadosh. When he came from Bavel to Eretz Israel, he brought Mishnayot with him. And they called those Mishnayot that they studied in Bavel, Mishnat Rabbi Natan. Right? It's known as Rabbi Natan HaBavli, the Babylonian Rabbi Natan. He also wrote books. He also wrote halachot that people studied. But none of them had the status of the Mishnah once it was published. Shemuel Amaru, right? And Shemuel, remember, Shemuel was the student of Rabbi Judah Nasi. Amru Gamken bekama mekomot Tana debe Shemuel, right? You see some places in the Talmud they quote from the Beit Midrash of Shemuel. ואלה המשניות אשר נלמדו תלמידי חכמים הראשונים לא נאמרו בשם רבי עקיבא. Right, and all of these earlier, previous Mishnayot that they studied, they weren't in the name of Rabbi Akiva. Remember, Rabbi Akiva was in Eretz Israel. This developed independently in Bavel. The Amrinan bekama mekomot Tana debe Rabbi Yishmael. Also, Rabbi Akiva, he himself didn't write. He had some writings, but most of the writings were done by his students, like Rabbi Yishmael. והיו ברייתות גם כן לראשוני הראשונים, כדאמרינן בעירובין, right? And also, a lot of the previous Hachamim also had different baraitot, right? That they were also quoted, right? Taneh bar Mare debe Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai. Who remembers Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai? He was the president of the court in the times of the destruction of the temple. He was the teacher of Rabbi Eliezer HaGadol, who was the teacher of Rabbi Akiva. So here we're talking about things that are quoted, literature that's quoted pre-Rabbi Akiva, before the times of Rabbi Akiva. But all of this literature, all this external literature to the Mishnah, לא קבעו ללמדם לכל בני אדם כמו שנקבעה ברייתא דרבי חייא ודרבי הושעיה. none of them were set or accepted by the Hachamim to be publicly taught to everybody, meaning mandatory in their curriculum, the same way that the Baraitot of Rabbi Hiya and Rabbi Oshaya were accepted, right? So even though they are a pre-Mishnah time, and maybe some of those that literature is quoted in the Mishnah itself, right? None of those compositions got the status that the Baraita or the Tosefta of Rabbi Hiya got. And that's why when they're quoted in the Talmud, they're never quoted as Tanu Rabbanan, right? They're never quoted as this is something that all the Hachamim quote, Ela Tanya, which is in singular form, Tanya, Vitana, Vituna. And meaning you can't, the meaning of it having a higher status than the others is you can't contradict something in the Tosefta with something that was written by any of the other external books, even though the Tosefta itself was also external. You could only bring it if it helps you understand something in the Tosefta. It comes to complement the Tosefta or the Mishnah. There could be cases where it contradicts the Tosefta and the Mishnah, and that's fine. But we're not going to accept it as halacha, because our main source for halacha is the Mishnah, right? The Tosefta comes to elaborate on the Mishnah. And again, what makes something authoritative is not who said it, not when it was said, but the fact that it was accepted by, or there's public consensus on this, and it's accepted and it's widespread, right? Tanu Rabbanan, meaning it was quoted publicly by all the Chachamim. Doesn't matter if it's right or wrong. There is no right or wrong. What matters is this is what we accepted as a public. And so therefore you can't come and contradict it. You can only complement it or try to use something else to help you understand it. But because this is public domain, right, it has precedence over everything else. וספרה וספרי גם כן לא נתפשטו אצל החכמים כמו משנתנו. And so too, the Sifra and Sifri that we saw, some of them were written even by the students of Rabbi Akiva, and some of them were written pre-Mishnah, and some of them were written post-Mishnah by the students of Rabbi Judah Hanasi. Lo nitpashtu, not lo nitpashtu means they didn't spread out throughout all of the Chachamim the same way that the Mishnah did, and the same way that the Tosefta did. דמזמן תיקונה נתפשטה בכל ישראל אלא קלי קלי. Right? Because from the time that it was written, it spread out little by little, and not publicly or massively accepted by everybody. ואחרי כן קבעו ספרה וספרי ותוספתא בכל התלמוד. And later on, they incorporated some of these things into the Talmud, right? But only if it doesn't contradict the Mishnah or the Tosefta. But they could be quoted in the Talmud to help understand the Mishnah and the Tosefta. Ve'en kes le'ele habaraitot, right? And there's no end to all of these baraitot, right? So you have to give like a hierarchy between what we're going to study, because if one person studies the Mishnah and another one only studies Tosefta, right? Because nobody could cover everything. So then there's going to be no consensus among anybody, and we'll never get anything done. So they say, no, okay. The Ikar is the Mishnah. After the Mishnah, there's the Tosefta. Besides that, there's tons of other stuff. Some people master the Mishnah of Rabbi Oshaya, and one of Rabbi Ishmael, and one of Shemuel, and one of Rav, right? Maybe it speaks to me more. I don't know. My name is Shemuel, and so I have a liking to Tannaim Era Shemuel. So I'm going to master that. And someone else is going to master something else. He likes his style more, right? Everyone's going to know something else better than everyone else. However, everybody needs to know the Mishnah first and the Tosefta next. And then everyone could bring Chidushim from anything else that they study. But they're secondary to the Mishnah and the Tosefta. Right, so one Hacham is great in Tannaim Era Shemuel, and so when he taught his students, after studying the Tosefta and the Mishnah and then the Tosefta, his focus was more on the Mishnayot of Shemuel as opposed to of Rabbi Ishmael. וחכמי Amoraim שהיו אחרי רבי נצטרכו יותר לאלו הברייתות. Right, so in the times of Rabbi Judah HaNasi, remember we said, Rabbi Judah HaNasi would say, מאימתי קוראים קריאת שמע בערבית, משעה שהכהנים נכנסים, from the time that the Kohanim gather to eat their terumah. All right, so in the times of Rabbi Judah HaNasi, people understood what that meant. But the Chachamim that came afterwards, the Amoraim, they needed more explanation. So they needed these baraitot. They say, oh, okay, well, in Tannaim Era Shemuel, it actually mentions that the time that the Kohanim go gather to eat is after sunset. Okay, so that explains, that could help me understand the Mishnah. And so someone will bring that. However, if there's a Tosefta that says something similar, then we'll prefer what the Tosefta has to say. כי מהם הוציאו כל הדברים העמוקים אשר נאמרו בלשון קצר וברמזים ובכללים. Right? Because all these other books help us understand all these things that were hinted to in the Mishnah, because they were written very briefly in the Mishnah. ומהם יצאו ענפים וחידושים ותולדות. From there it spreads, it's like a tree with branches that spread out. Right, so you have one phrase in the Mishnah, and it's alluding to many different things. And in order to connect all those many different things, all these other books can help you tie it back into the Mishnah. If you don't know the Mishnah, all the things that it's hinting to, which if you come after the generation of Rebbe and Rebbe Hiya, you're going to have a very difficult time without mastering all these other writings as well. Right, as we said earlier, he only mentioned the Ikar, right? The Ikar meaning the general rule, the main general rule. Right, and he didn't bring everything that's derived from them. And that's why the Chachamim, they needed all these extra things in order to extract the halachot. And they needed all these writings, right, to compare them. Right? So Rabbi Ishmael says this, and Rabbi Shemuel says this, and the Mishnah, I can see what, they help me understand the Mishnah. All right, and from there to extract the general rule from the Mishnah. This was, I'll agree, a little bit difficult, a difficult section. But this is very fundamental to understanding how the Talmud itself was composed. right? So we said there were many writings before. Rabbi Judah Hanasi came and he started to organize everything. He took all the writings and tried to formulate something as concise as possible so that it can spread out with everybody, that everybody can memorize off by heart and recite. What's the downside of that? Is that every sentence needs to hint to maybe 5 or 10 different things. And if you're not a genius living at the time of Rabbi Judah Hanasi, you're going to have a hard time connecting all those things. So then the students of Rabbi Judah Hanasi, what do? They wrote all these different compositions, all this other Amoraim literature. And the best out of all of them is what they call the Tosefta of Rabbi Hiya. However, there's no end to all of this literature, and nobody can cover it all. So what was accepted by everybody was the Tosefta. So we have the Mishnah, which everybody has to study, and everything else comes to explain the Mishnah. However, we can't know all of these other things. We can't cover it all. We can't master them all. Everybody has to master the Tosefta, and everybody can choose their own other baraitot, external literature. And they all use that to connect the halachot into the Mishnah. Now you can understand what the Chachamim had to prepare 5 months for in order to discuss one tractate over the course of an entire month in the yeshiva. This is what they were studying. Everybody was studying, first of all, the Mishnah, and then they were studying the Tosefta, and whoever knew, Tannaim Era, so they studied that, and someone else did Tannaim Rabbi Ishmael, and the other one was Rabbi Yohanan, and the other one was this, and everyone, the Sifra, and the Sifrei, everyone would study whatever it is that they're most comfortable with other than the Mishnah and the Tosefta. They'd prepare Masechet Berachot for 5 months and gather in the yeshiva and discuss and try to explain the Mishnah based on everything that each one knows, what each one mastered. And the recordings of all of those discussions, even though this went on for many, many years, it was later on recorded in writing, and that is the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud that developed later on. Any questions?
So some of the Sifri are like midrashic texts.
The midrash. When you say midrashic, I'm assuming you mean like story midrashic, right?
Yeah, like similar, but earlier.
Right. No. Okay. So this falls under the category of midrash halacha. Midrash doesn't necessarily mean like a story or a tale or like a legend or something. Midrash is how do you explain a pasuk. So there's 2 types of midrashim. There's a midrash that says, so and this is like the backstory of Sarah, right? She was 3 years old and this happened to her. Or Avraham Avinu was 3 years old or 5 years old when he discovered God, and they can base this off of a pasuk. It's how you are doresh the pasuk. Sifra and Sifri is how do you extract the halacha from the pasuk, right? It's a different way of doing a midrash, and it's called midrash halacha, as opposed to what we said before, which is called midrash agada. It's 2 different types of midrashim. Anything else?
Sami, when you said that this is how they studied before. Like this is how they studied before. My question is, how should we approach Mishnah nowadays? Like it seems like it's very complicated.
The Mishnah itself specifically.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the Mishnah is still, the Chachamim, even post-Mishnah and post-Talmud, they still always recommended studying the Mishnah. Before you study Talmud, you should study Mishnah. So the first they say, study the Torah shebichtav, right? They say, ben hamesh lamikra. You say this in Pirkei Avot. When you're 5 years old, you start studying the Torah shebichtav, the written Torah, right? Ben eser la Mishnah, right? At 10 years old, you start studying the Mishnah. If you haven't studied the Torah shebichtav yet, even if you're 40 years old, start with that. And then when you finish that, you move on to the Mishnah. Halacha lema'aseh, meaning if you want to learn halachot, you're going to have a very difficult time doing that, studying the Mishnah. I mean, they have commentaries today on the Mishnah that'll tell you what the halacha is. However, you're not going to cover all of Hilchot Shabbat by studying Masechet Shabbat in the Mishnah. But it's a very good thing to study and memorize. So we have a tune. I don't know, different communities have different tunes. I'm Moroccan, so we do. מאימתי קוראים קריאת שמע בערבית משעה שהכהנים נכנסים לאכול בתרומתן עד סוף השמורה הראשונה דברי רבי אליעזר חכמים אומרים ארצות. Right, and that's how you can memorize it. That's the best way to study Mishnah. However, don't think that studying Mishnah you're gonna cover all of halakha. Study Masechet Berachot, all right, you're not gonna know all the halachot regarding Berachot from studying it in the Mishnah.